evening. I'm Don Myers, and you're watching Dear Don, the segment where you are the star because it's your letters I read, your questions I answer, your sometimes irritating or meaningless concerns I hold up to public scrutiny. Our viewer tonight writes in and asks, Dear Don, Dr. Ruth Westheimer, that cross between Sigmund Freud, Oprah Winfrey, and a munchkin, she says that masturbation is a normal and healthy part of sexual development, if not done in excess. What do you think? Sincerely, just curious. P.S. By the way, I'm just curious, but why does everyone who writes to you put a P.S. at the end of their letters? Well, just curious. I'm glad you asked about this potentially touchy subject. Dr. Ruth is partly right. Like most things, a little masturbation is harmless, but too much is downright unhealthy. You'll find it interesting to know, just curious, that recent studies show that people who masturbate too much suffer sudden memory lapses similar to the symptoms of amnesia or even schizophrenia. I think that's scary. I mean, perfectly normal-looking people will just blank out like that simply because they masturbate too much. Don't you find that as scary, Curious, by George? And don't you find Curious George just so cute? I mean, I love that little monkey. He was just a little darling little brown guy. And do you remember his explorer friend in the natty pith helmet and explorer's outfit? Oh yeah, I read all the Curious George books when I was a kid. Of course, Curious George didn't act much like a monkey, but I think not as a monkey, but as a character per se. He personified the innocence and naivety we all had as children. I mean, like the time that George went to the hospital and got lost, and they had to find him, or the time George visited the department store, or the time George visited Washington, D.C., or the time George chopped down the cherry tree, and since he couldn't tell a lie after he chopped down the cherry bush, when his father came up to him at the White House and said, I'm just curious, George Bush. You knew that the president was making an arms for hostages deal, and you just went along with it. I mean, why? Well, this is just another example of the lack of leadership of the Reagan administration. I mean, that crazy old man was ready to sell arms to the Iranians for peanuts. I mean, he must have been suffering from temporary amnesia, or even schizophrenia. Well, you say a little corruption in politics is normal? Well, like most things, a little corruption is normal, but too much corruption is downright disgusting. I mean, the only guy that I like in the White House right now is George Shultz. George Shultz isn't corrupt. George Shultz is a good Secretary of State. And I'm crazy about all of Shultz's Peanuts characters like Snoopy and Charlie Brown and Linus. Oh, that little zigzag on Charlie Brown's shirt is just so darling. None of the Peanuts characters act much like children, though, but I think not as children, but as characters per se. They personify the lost innocence and world weariness we all feel as adults. I mean, like the time Charlie Brown got all depressed because the cherry tree he chopped down for the Christmas pageant was so scraggly, and when he brought it into the Christmas pageant, all its needles fell off, and Linus had to wrap his blanket around the bottom of it, and then Linus made a speech about Christmas being over-commercialized. Well, now don't get me wrong. I mean, like a little commercialization is harmless, but like most things, although a little is fine, too much of it can be downright unbearable. I mean, like when you see that commercial with Santa Claus zooming around in that giant flying Norelco electric razor. I mean, what's next? Baby Jesus selling McDonald's gift certificates? Well, something to think about. Anyway, keep those cards and letters coming, and stay tuned for the rest of tonight's show. Gee, I don't know, Burger. I kind of lost my place there. Did it look okay to you?
Same as usual, Don.